Kant set out to do something extremely ambitious. He wanted to build a system of morality that did not depend on feelings, culture, religion, or personal preference. In his view, those things were unstable. They changed from person to person, from place to place, and from moment to moment. If morality depended on them, then right and wrong would never be fully reliable. So he tried to ground morality in something that does not change, which is reason itself. At first, this feels like a serious upgrade. Instead of guessing what is right based on how you feel or what others expect, you have a principle that applies universally. You do not ask what works in this situation or what benefits you. You ask whether the rule behind your action could apply to everyone without contradiction. If it can, then it is morally acceptable. If it cannot, then it is not. It sounds clean, disciplined, and intellectually honest. The problem begins when this idea meets real situations. Because real situations are not built like philosophical examples. They are dense, layered, and often ambiguous. You are not just choosing between clearly defined actions. You are dealing with incomplete information, emotional pressure, relationships that matter to you, and consequences that are not always predictable. In those conditions, applying a universal rule is not straightforward. It requires interpretation, and that is where things start to slip. Kant's method depends heavily on how you describe the action you are evaluating. A single situation can be framed in multiple ways, and each framing can lead to a different conclusion. You can describe an action narrowly, focusing on the immediate intent, or broadly, including its wider implications. Depending on that choice, the same action can appear either acceptable or unacceptable within the system. This is not a minor issue. It means the clarity the system promises is not actually built into the rule itself, but into how the situation is interpreted before the rule is applied. So instead of removing confusion, the system relocates it. You're no longer uncertain about what you feel. You are uncertain about how to correctly define what you are doing. And that kind of uncertainty is harder to resolve because it operates at the level of reasoning itself. You can think through a situation repeatedly and still not arrive at a stable answer, because each version of the situation generates a different outcome. There's also a deeper tension in how Kant treats consequences. He deliberately removes them from the core of moral evaluation. What matters is not what happens, but whether the principle behind your action is logically consistent. This creates a kind of moral purity, but it also creates distance from how actions actually matter in the world. In real life, outcomes are not secondary. They are part of what gives actions their weight. Ignoring them does not make morality cleaner. It makes it less connected to the reality it is supposed to guide. This is where the system begins to feel difficult to live with. You are asked to act according to rules that are abstracted from the situations you are in. You are asked to ignore factors that feel relevant and to focus on a level of reasoning that can become increasingly detached from what is actually happening. And the more seriously you try to follow this, the more you notice the gap between the system and the world. That gap creates hesitation. You start second-guessing not just what you should do, but how you should even think about what you are doing. You question whether your reasoning is properly universal, whether your framing is correct, whether you're being consistent enough. And while you're doing that, the situation itself continues to move. Real life does not pause while you resolve philosophical precision. This is the point where something important shifts. Morality is supposed to guide action. It is supposed to help you move through complex situations with some degree of clarity. But here it begins to slow you down instead. Not because thinking is bad, but because the system demands a level of abstraction that makes immediate judgment difficult. You are no longer responding directly to the situation. You are translating it into a form that fits the system and then evaluating that translation. And that extra step changes everything. It creates distance between you and your own decisions. You're no longer acting from within the situation. You're acting from a constructed version of it that can make your decisions more consistent in theory, but it can also make them less responsive to what actually matters in practice. This is why Kant's morality can feel both impressive and frustrating at the same time. It is rigorous, but rigid. It is principled, but often detached. It promises clarity, but frequently delivers complexity. And the more seriously you engage with it, the more you notice that the confusion it was meant to eliminate has not disappeared. It has simply taken a different form, one that operates at a deeper and more difficult level to resolve. Once you take Kant's framework seriously, the difficulty is no longer just about applying a rule. It begins to change how you understand what a moral decision even is. Instead of asking what matters in this situation, you are trained to ask what must be true in all situations. That shift sounds subtle, but it moves you away from the particular and into the abstract. You are no longer grounded in the concrete reality in front of you. You are operating at a level where the details that make a situation meaningful are treated as distractions rather than essential elements. This is where the tension becomes harder to ignore, because moral life does not happen in the abstract. It happens in specific contexts, with specific people, under conditions that are rarely clean or repeatable. When you remove that context in order to achieve universality, you do not just simplify the situation. You risk stripping away the very features that make the decision morally significant in the first place. What remains is structurally consistent, but potentially disconnected from what actually matters. Kant is aware of this problem, but his solution intensifies it. He insists that moral worth comes from acting out of duty, not from inclination. In other words, it is not enough to do the right thing. You must do it for the right reason, and that reason must be grounded in respect for the moral law rather than in emotion, sympathy, or personal attachment. This creates a very strict standard. It is not just your action that is evaluated, but the motive behind it, and that motive must be purified of anything contingent or personal. At a theoretical level, this is elegant. It protects morality from being reduced to self-interest or emotional impulse. But in practice, it creates a strange inversion. Qualities that we normally associate with moral depth, such as care, empathy, and responsiveness to others, are no longer central. In fact, they become morally irrelevant unless they align perfectly with duty. You can help someone out of genuine compassion, and according to this framework, that action does not carry true moral worth unless it is also grounded in duty. This is where the system begins to feel not just demanding, but misaligned with how moral experience actually unfolds. Because when you examine real moral situations, what matters is often precisely those elements Kant tries to set aside. The ability to recognize another person's suffering, to respond appropriately to the nuances of a situation, to balance competing concerns without reducing them to a single rule. These are not weaknesses in moral reasoning. They are part of what makes it possible. By excluding them, Kant creates a model of moral agency that is internally consistent but psychologically unrealistic. It asks you to operate as if you can step completely outside your own perspective, outside your relationships, outside your emotional life, and act purely as a rational agent applying universal law. But in reality, you never fully occupy that position. Your understanding is always shaped by context, by history, by the particular situation you are in. This leads to a deeper issue that is often overlooked. Kant's system assumes that reason, when properly used, will converge on clear moral conclusions. But reason does not operate in a vacuum. It depends on how situations are framed, what details are considered relevant, and how concepts are interpreted. Two people can apply the same principle and arrive at different conclusions, not because one is irrational, but because they are working with different understandings of the situation. So the idea that reason alone can eliminate moral disagreement becomes difficult to sustain. Instead of removing ambiguity, the system can intensify it at a higher level. You are no longer arguing about outcomes or preferences. You are arguing about the correct formulation of a universal rule, the proper interpretation of a situation, the exact structure of a maxim. These are not questions that admit easy resolution, and they often lead to the kind of abstract disputes that feel disconnected from practical decision-making. At this point, the original promise of clarity begins to collapse under its own weight. The more rigorously you try to apply the system, the more complex it becomes. You are required to perform a kind of moral analysis that is both highly technical and deeply uncertain. You're trying to achieve precision in a domain that resists it, and the result is not clarity but a refined form of confusion. This has a direct impact on action. When the criteria for moral correctness become this demanding, hesitation is almost inevitable. You're not just deciding what to do. You're evaluating whether your reasoning meets a standard that is difficult to fully satisfy. And because that standard is internal rather than external, there's no clear point at which you could be completely confident that you have met it. There's always room for doubt, always the possibility that your maxim was formulated incorrectly, that you overlooked a relevant detail, that your reasoning was not as universal as it should have been. This creates a kind of moral pressure that does not resolve into guidance. Instead of helping you act, it can leave you circling the decision, refining it, questioning it, without ever reaching a point of genuine certainty. And even when you do act, that uncertainty does not disappear. It follows the action, leaving you unsure whether you acted for the right reason, whether your justification was valid, whether you truly met the standard the system demands. At this stage, the issue is no longer that Kant's morality is difficult. It is that it begins to lose its practical function. A moral system is not just supposed to be logically coherent. It is supposed to guide human beings in real conditions, under real constraints. When the gap between the system and those conditions becomes too wide, the system may remain intellectually impressive, but it becomes less usable. This is the sense in which it becomes not false, but strained. It captures something important about the need for consistency and the danger of self-serving reasoning. But it does so by imposing a structure that is too rigid to accommodate the full complexity of moral life. And in trying to eliminate confusion completely, it ends up producing a form of confusion that is more abstract, more persistent, and ultimately harder to resolve. At this point, the real question is no longer whether Kant's system is internally consistent. It largely is. The question is whether that kind of consistency is enough to carry the weight we place on morality in actual life. Because morality is not just a structure of reasoning. It is something that has to function within time, pressure, uncertainty, and human limitation. It has to work not only when we are thinking carefully, but when we are forced to act without the luxury of perfect clarity. And this is where Kant's framework begins to show its limits more clearly. It assumes that moral agents can step back far enough from their situation to evaluate it in purely universal terms, and then step forward again to act on that evaluation without distortion. But that movement from involvement to abstraction and back again is not as clean as the theory requires. In practice, the act of stepping back changes how the situation appears, and not always in a way that preserves what is most important about it. When you translate a concrete situation into a universal maxim, you're already selecting which features matter and which do not. That selection is not neutral. It reflects judgment, interpretation, and sometimes bias. By the time you apply the rule, you are no longer dealing with the original situation, but with a filtered version of it. And the more you refine that process, the more you risk losing the very elements that gave the situation its moral weight. This creates a structural problem that cannot be solved simply by being more careful. No matter how precise you try to be, there's always a gap between the lived situation and the abstract formulation you use to evaluate it. And because Kant's system operates entirely at the level of that formulation, it cannot fully account for what is lost in translation. The result is a form of moral reasoning that is exact in structure, but incomplete in substance. This is why the system can feel both compelling and insufficient at the same time. It captures the importance of acting on principles rather than impulses. It guards against the tendency to justify actions based on convenience or self-interest. But in doing so, it sets aside other aspects of moral life that are not reducible to universal rules. The ability to recognize context, to respond to particular relationships, to weigh consequences without reducing everything to calculation. These are not weaknesses in moral thinking. They are part of what allows it to function in reality. Kant's framework has difficulty accommodating this without compromising its core commitment to universality. If you allow context to play a significant role, then the system begins to lose the strict consistency that defines it. But if you exclude context, then the system becomes detached from the situations it is meant to guide. This is not a problem that can be easily resolved from within the framework itself, because it arises from the very principles that give the system its strength. As a result, what you are left with is a kind of tension that does not disappear. On one side, there is the appeal of a morality grounded in reason, one that aspires to objectivity and consistency. On the other side, there is the reality of human life, which resists being fully captured by abstract rules. The more you try to force one onto the other, the more friction you create. Either the theory becomes rigid, or the practice becomes inconsistent. This is where the sense that Kant made morality more confusing begins to make sense in a deeper way. It is not that he introduced confusion where there was none. Moral life has always involved difficulty and uncertainty. What he did was shift the location of that difficulty. Instead of struggling primarily with what matters in a situation, you begin to struggle with how to correctly represent the situation within a formal structure. The challenge becomes less about judgment and more about formulation. And that shift has consequences. It can make moral thinking feel more technical, but less grounded. You become skilled at analyzing principles, but less certain about how those principles connect to the realities you are facing. You gain precision at the level of theory, but lose some degree of confidence at the level of action. At this point, the system risks becoming self-contained. It continues to generate answers within its own structure, but those answers do not always translate smoothly into lived decisions. And when that happens repeatedly, the system starts to feel less like a guide and more like a framework you consult but cannot fully rely on. It remains intellectually significant, but practically strained. The way forward is not to discard what Kant was trying to do. There is real value in his insistence that morality cannot be reduced to impulse or convenience. There is value in the idea that our actions should be accountable to principles that extend beyond our immediate interests. But that insight does not require the level of abstraction that disconnects moral reasoning from the conditions in which it has to operate. A more workable approach recognizes that moral understanding has to move in both directions. It must be capable of rising to the level of principle, but also of returning to the level of context without losing sensitivity to what is actually at stake. It must allow for consistency without demanding rigidity, and for responsiveness without collapsing into arbitrariness. That balance is difficult, and it does not produce the kind of clean certainty Kant was aiming for, but it remains closer to how moral life is actually lived. And in that sense, the lasting issue is not that Kant failed, but that his solution was too narrow for the complexity of the problem. He clarified one dimension of morality with extraordinary precision, but in doing so, he made it harder to see how that dimension fits within the broader, less orderly reality we have to navigate. That is why the system can feel both brilliant and unusable at the same time. It achieves clarity by stepping away from the very conditions that give morality its meaning. And once you notice that the confusion it leaves behind is not accidental, it is built into the structure itself.